So I've managed to clean out all the epoxy from my previous repair attempt, busted it out in chunks and pieces. So I got this all cleaned up and ready to figure out what I'm going to do next. We got the hinge here that is supposed to sit down here like this. There's an extra hole right up here at the top, which has no standoff or anything to support it. One of the mounting holes for the tabs on the LCD panel lines up with that. I have some miniature little nuts. I'm thinking of epoxying one of those right in the appropriate spot right about there. And then that'll give me one more support point to screw down to, maybe make it a little stronger. If you look at the other side hinge here, I notice that there is another little molded in threaded insert right here that is just gone on this side. It would have been right there. Must have got lost in my previous disassembly. So I've cleaned all the plastic off of those little threaded inserts that were molded into the plastic. And I've taken a little bit of super glue on the bottom just to kind of stick them down where they belong, over on this side, and the one by the hinge over on this side. I did find this one right here that the LCD screws into, and I glued that back down where it belongs as well. So next step is to glob it up with epoxy again, I guess. So I made a trip to the local hardware store, bought myself some small 2mm and 2.5mm screws and nuts. I think the idea is I'm going to take one of these little 2mm nuts and put it, glue it down, say right about there, so that when I put this hinge back, I'll have another attachment point right there. I can get one more screw in here for some extra support, and that'll go through the tab that holds the LCD. These screws here are too long, I'll have to cut them down, but they didn't have any shorter ones. So whatever I do to fix this, I'm thinking of filling this whole area up with epoxy underneath the hinge, and maybe even trying to glue the hinge plate down. But I got to make sure I keep it all from here over so that the LCD panel will actually fit back in. And then I got to make sure whatever wires need to go through here can still get through, but I'm thinking of somehow just making a little dam around here and just filling that whole corner up with epoxy, and maybe even clamping the hinge and gluing it. Okay, so I've glued down that extra nut, and I've built a little dam here out of some metal tape just to keep epoxy out of the area where the LCD panel has to sit. I'm going to use some 2-part JB Weld epoxy this time. I think that'll work better than the cheap, just clear 2-part epoxy I used before. I think this will work better too because its consistency is a little thicker than the other clear stuff that is hard to get it to stay where you want it when you're putting it around the nuts and stuff. It tends to flow and flatten out. This is a little thicker, so I think it'll work better. So I've got some JB Weld epoxy around the insert nuts I put back in place. I found out that you don't have as much working time as I thought, that it doesn't work well once it starts to get a little stiff. So on this one here, I ended up having to pick it back out and do it over a second time because the epoxy started getting a little bit too stiff and it didn't flow right and attach itself to the plastic right. This side, which I did second, comes out a little, nicer looking. So I think what I'm going to do next is mix up a big batch of epoxy, and I'm going to take each hinge, I'm going to fill in this whole area here in the corner all the way around and up to here. Keep it out of this path where the wires go through on each side, but fill in around as much as I can in here, and then screw this hinge back down in place really quick and clamp it maybe, and see if I can actually get the JB Weld adhesive to bond to the hinge itself, so that maybe that will also provide a little additional support. And even if it doesn't bond very well directly to the hinge, it will having that behind the hinge will maybe provide a little additional support. So there we go, the hinge is put back in place. I got it all filled with epoxy underneath the hinge, so hopefully that helps too. I've got the nut under here so that when I put the LCD panel back down, I'll screw it down with 2 screws instead of just 1, and that will help hold the hinge down. I've turned a couple of these longer screws into shorter screws with the Dremel tool so that they'll fit here. Hopefully the head isn't too thick. Now I'm going to let the epoxy cure overnight and make sure it's good and solid before I stress it out by twisting on the hinges. So I've got the panel back in, hinges all screwed down. These extra screws I was going to put in right here. Turns out the heads were a bit too thick. The front panel didn't feel like it was going to fit, so I ended up filing the heads down to make the screws a lot thinner. So hopefully that works. Got the wires kind of back through the hinges. Now the fun part is getting all the fingerprints off of everything before I put it all back together. There we go, polished to as clean as the day it came out of the factory, hopefully. Well, the panel is back together. Took me 2 tries to get it together without any dust bunnies floating around inside. Another thing is, be careful when you're handling this stuff, because I ended up with a pretty good scratch on the screen right here, but there's not much I can do about that now. Well, it's all back together now. The hinges seem to work okay, except this corner of the panel doesn't quite want to stay snapped together, but I might just put a little drop of hot glue in there to fix that. One casualty is that this touchscreen doesn't work anymore. It was intermittent before I took it apart. I think the hinge flopping around inside the LCD panel had already damaged the cable. But then, to make matters worse, when I put the bottom cover on, I didn't have the cable in the right spot and I pinched it. It's a tiny thin little cable. It's only got like maybe 6 wires in it or 4 wires in it. So I don't know if I want to attempt to repair that. I'm not going to try it right now. I'd have to take everything all apart back again. So for now I think I'm just going to call it good and be glad I can actually close the thing.